The moment the manager bowed in front of Shaq, the whole restaurant seemed to freeze in place. The clinking of glasses stopped. The soft music in the background felt distant, and every pair of eyes turned toward the table where Shaq sat calmly. The revelation spread like a quiet storm. The man who had been mocked was not just any guest, he was the true owner of the restaurant. The young server stood stiff, his confident smirk gone. His eyes darted between Shaq and the manager, sweat forming at his temples. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The proud tone he had carried all evening vanished, replaced by a growing fear that choked his voice. Customers whispered louder now, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others leaning closer to their companions to share the shocking truth. The manager straightened up, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. "Sir, we didn't know you would be visiting tonight," he said softly, his voice trembling with both respect and worry. Shaq gave a calm nod, his face steady. "I came for a quiet meal," he said, "but it seems quiet is hard to find here." His words were measured, not loud, yet they carried through the room like a heavy weight. The older waiter, the one who had warned the young server earlier, closed his eyes for a moment. He had known something was off, and now he silently prayed the manager would handle the situation. Carefully, the other staff members exchanged nervous glances, each one realizing how serious the matter had become. The young server finally found his voice, though it shook with panic. I didn't know, sir, I thought—" His words trailed off. He wanted to explain, to excuse his arrogance, but the truth was plain for everyone to see. He had judged Shaq by his clothes, his quiet entrance, and his lack of flash. He had believed. Power came only from appearance. And now that belief was collapsing in front of him. The manager turned sharply to the server, his face hard with anger. "Do you realize what you've done?" he hissed. "You insulted the man who created everything in this place, the man who gave you a job, the man who owns the very floor you're standing on." The words cut deep, and the server felt smaller with every sentence. His pride, which had carried him all evening, now crumbled into shame. Shaq, however, remained calm. He leaned back in his chair, his deep eyes fixed on the trembling server. His tone was steady, almost gentle. "Respect is free," he said. "It costs nothing to treat someone with kindness, but arrogance can cost you everything." The restaurant fell silent again, every customer hanging on his words. It wasn't just a rebuke. It was a lesson, a truth too powerful to ignore. The young server lowered his head, his shoulders heavy. He wished the ground would open and swallow him whole. Every insult he had thrown earlier replayed in his mind like echoes. Each one sounded louder now, more foolish, more cruel. He had mocked the very man who signed his paycheck. He had embarrassed himself, not just in front of one man, but in front of an entire room filled with witnesses. The manager looked at Shaq nervously, waiting for his command. The fate of the young server hung in the air. Shaq could have ended his career in an instant, with just one word. Instead, Shaq took a slow breath, his expression calm but firm. He wasn't a man of quick anger. He was a man who believed in lessons, and tonight's lesson was only beginning. Around the room, the atmosphere had shifted. Customers no longer laughed or whispered mockingly. They looked at Shaq with admiration, some even with respect deeper than before. The story unfolding before them was not just about food or service. It was about dignity, humility, and the danger of judging a man by appearances. The server's knees felt weak, his hands shook. He opened his mouth again, desperate to apologize. But before he could, Shaq raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult could have been. It was clear to everyone that the true moment of judgment had not yet arrived. The night was no longer about a simple dinner. It had turned into a stage where a powerful lesson in respect and humility was about to be delivered. And everyone in that restaurant, every guest, every worker, every bystander, would carry that memory long after the plates were cleared. The air inside the restaurant felt heavy, as if every breath carried the weight of what had just been revealed. The young server's hands shook at his sides, his earlier pride nowhere to be found. He had thought himself clever, powerful even, when mocking a man he believed was out of place. But now the truth had shattered that illusion. This quiet guest was not only someone important, he was the owner of the very restaurant the server worked in. Shaq sat calmly at the table, his large frame relaxed, his expression unreadable. He cut another piece of steak and chewed slowly, as if nothing unusual had happened. His calmness only deepened the tension. Customers leaned forward, waiting for his next words. The young server shifted nervously from one foot to the other, his lips dry, his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. Finally, Shaq wiped his mouth with a napkin and spoke. His voice was calm but carried across the dining hall. "Bring me the bill," he said. The request was ordinary, yet the tone carried power. The server swallowed hard, fumbling for the leather folder. His mind raced. Should he apologize now? Should he beg for mercy? But fear froze his tongue. He placed the bill on the table, his fingers trembling. Shaq opened it with quiet grace, scanned it once, then reached into his pocket. The black credit card slid onto the table with a soft tap. Its presence spoke louder than any words. Some customers gasped, a few whispered, and the young server's face went pale. He had mocked this man for not being able to afford the food, and now he was staring at a card that only the wealthiest could carry. The manager, still standing nearby, bent forward quickly, his voice urgent. "Sir, please, you don't need to pay. You own this place." His words echoed in the silence, and the server felt as though the ground had vanished beneath him. His chest tightened, his eyes burned. He wished the night could rewind, that his words could be taken back, but it was far too late. Shaq looked at the manager with a faint smile. "Even owners pay for their meals," he said simply. He handed the card over, his eyes fixed on the server. The gesture was small, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect, about showing that no one is above humility. The server opened his mouth to speak, desperate to find the courage. "Sir, I didn't mean—" But his voice broke halfway. His throat was dry, the shame too heavy. He remembered every insult, every mocking word, each one now a knife turning in his stomach. Customers who had witnessed it all stared at him, their eyes cold, their judgment unforgiving. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "You didn't know who I was. That much is true," he said. "But tell me, would you have treated another guest with respect if they were not the owner?" The question struck deep. The server's lips trembled, but no answer came because they all knew the truth. He wouldn't have. His arrogance wasn't about ignorance, it was about character. The silence stretched, broken only by the quiet scrape of cutlery as Shaq finished the last bite of his steak. The calmness in his actions was louder than anger, more powerful than shouting. He folded his napkin neatly and placed it on the table, then looked around the room. His eyes passed over. Each face, customers, staff, even the young server who now seemed smaller than ever. This place was built not just for fine food, but for respect, Shaq said, his voice deep and steady. Every person who walks in here should be treated with dignity, no matter who they are, no matter how they look. The words carried weight. They were not just directed at the server, but at everyone listening. A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the restaurant. The server's knees felt weak. His pride had shattered into dust. He could no longer look Shaq in the eyes. His world, which moments ago seemed secure, had been turned upside down by the simplest truth. Arrogance had blinded him, and humility had defeated him. The night had reached a turning point. The reveal was no longer just about ownership. It was about exposing the difference between pride and respect. The restaurant guests would leave with full stomachs, but more importantly, with a story they would never forget. And for the young server, this was only the beginning of his lesson, one that would echo in his life long after the night was over. The moment the manager's words echoed through the restaurant, the truth hit like a wave. He owns this place. That single sentence spread from table to table, whispered in shock, repeated in disbelief. The guests who had chuckled earlier at the insults now sat frozen. Some covered their mouths, others leaned forward in their seats as though they had just witnessed a scene straight from a movie. The young server's heart raced, sweat dripping. Down the back of his neck, his earlier confidence shattered. He replayed every word he had said, every insult, every smirk, every mocking comment about Shaq not belonging here. It was as though each memory rose up and slapped him in the face. He felt naked, stripped of pride, exposed to the judgment of the entire room. Shaq sat calmly, his large hands folded on the table. His expression was not angry, not cruel, but steady and powerful. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence alone carried more weight than any shouting could have. He looked at the server with eyes that were calm, yet heavy, with disappointment, and in that silence the server broke. I didn't know, sir," the young man stammered. His voice shook, his body trembling. I didn't mean—" He cut himself short because the excuses sounded weak even in his own ears. He had judged Shaq on appearances, nothing more, and now his mistake was laid bare for all to see. The manager glared at him, fury in his eyes. "You shamed this establishment tonight," he said sharply. "You insulted the man who built it from the ground up, the man who gives us all work. Do you understand what you've done?" The words rang like a hammer, and the server shrank further into himself, nodding rapidly, unable to speak. But then Shaq finally broke his silence. His voice was deep, slow, and carried across the hall. "You didn't know who I was," he said. "That's true, but does that excuse the way you treated me? Would you have respected me if I was just another man?" His question hung in the air like a sword, cutting through the silence. The server's lips parted, but nothing came out. His mind screamed for an answer, but his heart knew the truth. He wouldn't have. His arrogance wasn't about ignorance. It was about who he had chosen to be. A man who believed kindness was only owed to the wealthy or powerful. A man who forgot that respect is free. Gasps and murmurs spread among the customers. Many nodded at Shaq's words. An older gentleman at one table whispered to his wife, "That is the kind of lesson this young man will never forget." Another woman shook her head and muttered, "I've never seen patience like that. He could have shouted. He could have walked out. But he didn't." Shaq leaned back in his chair, his presence filling the room. His calmness was a storm in disguise. His words were simple but heavy. "Respect costs nothing," he said, "but arrogance can cost you everything." The sentence sank deep into the hearts of everyone listening. It wasn't just a rebuke. It was a life lesson. The server's knees weakened, and for a moment he thought he might fall. He bowed his head, whispering, "I'm sorry. Sir, I was wrong." His voice was quiet, but the entire restaurant heard it. The shame of his apology weighed heavier than the arrogance of his insults. He could feel every eye on him, every judgment burning into his skin. Shaq nodded slowly, accepting the apology but not excusing the act. His expression remained firm. "You will remember this night," he said softly. "Not because of the food you served, but because of the lesson it gave you. Never forget, dignity does not wear clothes, and wealth is not written on someone's face." The applause began softly from one corner of the restaurant. Then it grew louder, spreading like a wave. Soon the entire hall was filled with the sound of clapping. Customers stood in admiration, not just for Shaq's ownership, but for his wisdom. His calm strength had turned an insult into a lesson, a moment that none of them would ever forget. The server stood still, head bowed, tears of shame stinging his eyes. He knew that this moment would haunt him, but also change him. The truth had hit hard, harder than he could have imagined, and in that truth a new understanding was born. Respect is not earned through power, but through how you treat others. The sound of applause slowly faded, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt almost heavier than before. All eyes remained fixed on Shaq, who sat calmly, his presence filling the room like a quiet storm. The young server stood stiff as a statue, his head bowed, shame written all over his face. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by trembling hands and a racing heart. He knew the next words out of Shaq's mouth could decide his future. The manager waited nervously, shifting from one foot to the other. His jaw clenched as he thought of firing the server on the spot, but he held back, waiting for Shaq's judgment. The older waiter, who had seen everything from the beginning, kept shaking his head, whispering under his breath. "This boy will never forget this night." Shaq finally leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. His deep voice broke the silence, steady but commanding. "I could end your career tonight with one word," he said, his eyes locked on the server, who shivered under the weight of his gaze. "But I don't believe in destroying people. I believe in teaching lessons." The words caught everyone by surprise. The crowd expected punishment, expected anger. But instead, Shaq chose something stronger. Something that would last longer than any firing. Humiliation turned into growth. He looked at the server again and said clearly, "You will apologize. Not in private, not with excuses whispered under your breath. You will apologize here, in front of everyone, loud enough for every guest in this restaurant to hear." The server's throat went dry, his stomach twisted. His pride screamed at him to resist, but his job, his future, his dignity, all of it now hung on this moment. His lips trembled as he opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A few guests leaned forward, waiting, some even smirked, enjoying the taste of justice. Shaq's tone sharpened slightly. "Speak, young man. You had no problem insulting me in public, so you will have no problem apologizing in public." The server finally found his voice broken and weak. I'm sorry," he said softly. The words barely carried past the first few tables. Shaq shook his head slowly. "Louder," he commanded, "so that every single person who heard your insult will also hear your apology." The server swallowed hard, his cheeks burning red. He raised his head slightly, his voice shaking but louder this time. "I am sorry for insulting you. Sir, I was wrong. I judged you unfairly, and I disrespected you. Please forgive me." The restaurant remained silent for a moment. Everyone took in the sight of the once arrogant server bowing his head in shame. The apology, though painful, was real. His voice cracked with each word, his pride stripped away until only sincerity was left. Shaq studied him for a long moment. His face was calm but firm. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "Good," he said. "Remember this. Respect is not given because of who someone is. It is given because of who you are. And tonight you showed yourself to be a man ruled by pride. Don't let that happen again." The young server nodded rapidly, tears threatening to fall from his eyes. He whispered again, "Yes, sir, I understand. Thank you for giving me a chance." The manager stepped in quickly, bowing his head to Shaq. "Sir, I assure you this will never happen again. We will make sure respect is always the rule here." But Shaq raised his hand, silencing him. "Respect cannot be forced by rules alone," he said. "It must be lived by each person, every day." The guests began to clap softly again, not for the humiliation, but for the wisdom in Shaq's words. The sound grew louder until it filled the hall. This time it wasn't just applause. It was respect. The server stood with his head bowed, his pride broken, but in that moment he also felt something he had never felt before. A chance to change, a chance to rebuild himself as someone better. Shaq rose slowly from his chair, towering over the room. He looked at the server one last time, his deep eyes calm. "Learn from this night. If you forget it, you lose more than a job. You lose yourself." The words lingered in the air, sharp and unforgettable. The consequence had been delivered, not through punishment, but through a lesson so deep it would follow the young man for the rest of his life. The restaurant grew quiet again after the soft applause. Every guest watched as Shaq rose from his chair, his tall figure commanding the room without a single word. His calm power filled the air, heavier than any anger could have. The young server stood frozen, his head bowed, still trembling from the weight of his own shame. He had apologized, but the lesson wasn't over yet. Shaq looked around slowly, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the diners, wealthy couples in fine suits, families enjoying their evening, waiters and staff standing nervously at the edges of the hall. Each one had witnessed everything. Each one had seen arrogance brought low and patience turned into strength. Shaq's deep voice cut through the silence, firm but steady. "Tonight you all saw what happens when pride speaks louder than respect." The room was still, no one daring to move. "Respect," Shaq continued, "is not something you give only to the rich or to the powerful or to the ones you recognize. Respect must be given to every single person who walks through these doors, whether they wear fine clothes or old shoes, whether they sit at the corner table or the front. Respect costs you nothing, but gives you everything." Murmurs of agreement spread. Customers nodded, some even whispering to each other that they would never forget these words. A woman at one table wiped her eyes quietly, saying to her husband, "This is more than a restaurant. This is a reminder of who we should be." Shaq turned his gaze back to the young server. His expression softened, though his voice remained serious. "You made a mistake," he said. "A mistake that could have ended your career tonight. But instead, you have been given a second chance. Do not waste it. Let this shame guide you, let it change you. Arrogance may make you feel powerful for a moment, but humility will make you respected for life." The server's throat tightened as he nodded. His pride was gone, but in its place was a spark of something new. "Understanding," he whispered. "I will remember, sir, I promise." His words, though small, carried truth. Shaq nodded once, satisfied, then turned his attention back to the room. "I didn't build this place only to serve food," he said, his voice echoing. "I built it to create a space where everyone can feel welcome, where dignity is never questioned. If you leave here tonight with full stomachs, that is good. But if you leave here tonight with a lesson about respect, then this place has served its true purpose." The guests clapped again, louder this time. Not out of politeness, but from genuine admiration. Some stood to their feet, giving Shaq the kind of respect that cannot be bought. The manager bowed deeply. The older waiter smiled with pride, and even the youngest staff members felt the weight of what had been said. Shaq reached into his pocket and left a generous tip on the table, not out of anger or pride, but as a reminder that kindness always outweighs cruelty. Then he turned to leave, his calm steps echoing against the polished floor. Each footstep carried the lesson deeper into the hearts of those who watched him go. The young server remained standing, his eyes lowered, his face red with shame. But, for the first time in his life, he felt the heavy value of respect. He knew that this night had broken him, but also remade him. The lesson Shaq gave him would follow him forever. Respect all, no matter who they are, because the cost of arrogance is far too high. As Shaq reached the door, he paused and looked. Back just once. His voice rumbled across the hall, final and unforgettable. "Remember, true strength is shown not in how you treat those above you, but in how you treat those you think are beneath you." The door closed behind him, and the restaurant slowly came back to life. The guests returned to their meals, but their conversations carried a new tone, one of reflection, of admiration, of humility. They would tell this story again and again, passing it on as a lesson, and the young server. He would never again look at a customer as less than. He had been humbled, but he had also been given a chance to grow. That night, the restaurant did not just serve food. It served a truth, one that would outlast the meal, the night, and even the walls of that fine place. The story ended, not with anger or punishment, but with wisdom, a reminder that respect is the simplest gift we can give, and the most powerful one we can receive. The next morning, the restaurant felt different. The tables were the same, the lights the same, but the mood carried the weight of what had happened the night before. The staff moved quietly, speaking. In softer voices than usual, every one of them had replayed the scene in their minds. Shaq's calm words, the public apology, the lesson about respect that shook the entire room. The young server walked through the doors with his head bowed, low. His uniform looked neat, but his eyes carried exhaustion. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard his own mocking words, heard himself laughing at a man he thought was ordinary. And then he heard Shaq's calm voice, reminding him that arrogance can cost everything, that memory hit harder than any punishment. The manager called the staff together before the doors opened for the first customers. He cleared his throat and said, "Last night was not just another night of service. It was a reminder of who we are and what we stand for. This restaurant does not survive on food alone. It survives on respect. If we fail in that, then we fail completely." His voice was stern, but his eyes carried hope. The older waiter, the one who had tried to warn the young server, spoke up next. His voice calm but firm. "Respect is free, yet it is priceless. Never forget what you saw." This was not just about one mistake. It was about the kind of people we choose to be every day. The staff nodded quietly, some looking at the floor, others glancing at the young server with a mix of pity and caution. That day, the server worked differently. He greeted each customer with a bow, his voice humble, his smile careful, not forced, not arrogant, but respectful. His steps were slower, his words gentler. He poured water without spilling a drop, carried plates as if they were treasures. Customers noticed. Some smiled back warmly, sensing his sincerity. He was no longer the same man who believed power came from belittling others. But the story of that night had already spread beyond the walls of the restaurant. Guests who had been there told their friends. Families who had witnessed it shared the lesson over dinner tables. Within days, the tale reached people across the city. Big Shaq taught a young server the meaning of respect in his own restaurant. Some repeated it as gossip, others as inspiration. The message was clear. Humility matters more than pride. The young server, though embarrassed, began to see a change inside himself. He realized the shame he felt was not just punishment. It was fuel for growth. Each time he placed a dish on the table, he remembered Shaq's words. "Respect costs nothing." He whispered it in his head like a prayer, determined never to forget. One evening, about a week later, Shaq returned quietly. This time the staff recognized him instantly. They rushed to greet him warmly, the manager bowing deeply, the older waiter smiling proudly. But Shaq's eyes fell on the young server, who stood nervously clutching a tray. Shaq gave a small nod, an unspoken test. The server stepped forward, his voice steady though his heart raced. "Welcome back, sir. It is an honor to serve you tonight." His words were simple, but they carried weight. They were not about fear anymore. They were about genuine respect. Shaq's eyes softened as he nodded once more. "Good," he said. "You are learning." That night, the restaurant glowed, brighter, not because of the lights, not because of the food, but because a lesson had taken root. The guests enjoyed their meals, but more importantly, They left with the reminder that dignity is more valuable than gold. The young server still carried his shame, but now it was not a chain dragging him down. It was a seed pushing him to grow. And though he still felt the sting of his mistake, he also carried the hope of becoming better. The night he insulted Big Shaq would never leave his memory, but neither would the lesson that turned his pride into humility. Years passed since that unforgettable night in the restaurant. The memory of Big Shaq sitting calmly at the table, enduring insult after insult, remained carved deep into the young server's heart. Time had changed many things. The restaurant had grown even more successful. The staff had changed, but that single night lived on as a legend, whispered to every new employee as a reminder of what respect truly means. The young server, no longer young, had become one of the most reliable workers in the restaurant. He carried himself with humility, always treating each guest with kindness, whether it was a wealthy businessman in a tailored suit or a tired traveler in plain clothes. He served them with the same care. His reputation grew quietly. Customers left smiling, staff respected him, and the manager, who once scolded him harshly, now trusted him with training new hires. Often during quiet evenings, he would gather the new waiters and share his story. He didn't hide his shame. Instead, he told them the truth. "I once insulted the man who owned this place," he would say, his voice steady. "I judged him because of how he looked, and I thought I was clever. But that night, I learned that respect is the foundation of everything we do. Without it, no restaurant, no business, no person can stand." The young workers would listen wide-eyed, nodding as if hearing a lesson from a teacher. The story spread further. Some customers returned not only for the food, but for the atmosphere of dignity that filled the space. They could feel the difference in the service, the warmth in the greetings, the honesty in the smiles. That single lesson had shaped the culture of the entire place, and at its heart was the man who had once been arrogant, now transformed into someone humble and wise. One evening, long after the lesson, Big Shaq returned again. His presence was still commanding. Though time had softened his features, the restaurant buzzed with excitement at his arrival. But it was the server, now older, calmer, who approached his table, bowing respectfully. "Welcome back, sir," he said. "It is always an honor to serve you." Shaq studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You've changed," he said. His voice carried warmth, not disappointment this time. "I see it in how you stand, in how you speak. Tell me, what did you do with the lesson you learned that night?" The server's eyes glistened as he answered, "I carried it with me every day, sir. I made it my rule to respect everyone, rich or poor, weak or strong, and I've taught others to do the same. That night humbled me, but it also saved me. Without it, I would have lost myself to pride." His words were honest, and his voice did not shake. Shaq nodded slowly, satisfaction in his eyes. "Then the lesson was worth it," he said simply. He leaned back in his chair and added, "Wealth and power, titles, none of it matters if we forget respect. I'm glad you remembered." The server bowed deeply, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. He knew his life had been changed by one night, one mistake, and one man's patience. The memory of his arrogance still stung, but it no longer defined him. It had shaped him. As Shaq left the restaurant that night, the staff and customers stood straighter, their hearts full of admiration. The story of that night had become more than a tale. It was now a legacy, a living example of how humility can transform a life. The server watched Shaq go, his chest heavy with respect and thankfulness. He whispered to himself, "Respect costs nothing, but it gives you everything, And with that, the story closed, not with shame, but with growth, not with punishment, but with wisdom. The insult that could have ended everything had instead planted the seed of a new beginning, a seed that grew into a tree of humility, respect, and dignity that would shade everyone who entered those doors for years to come.